So my sermon series is about the matriarchs and the patriarchs of the Bible. And when we left off with Joseph last week, it said continued because there was a famine in Egypt, and Joseph rose through the ranks and was able to save his family. He was able to restore health to his brothers and father, and brought them into the land of Goshen, closer to where he was in Egypt. And that's kind of where we left off. And then Genesis ends, and Exodus picks up the story. But it's hundreds of years later, and this is from the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verses 8 through chapter 2, verse 10. And it says this: Now a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, and so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiprah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that a baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now a man from Levi's household married to a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that the baby was healthy and beautiful, so she hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she took a reed basket and sealed it up with black tar. She put the child in the basket and set the basket among the reeds at the riverbank. The baby's older sister stood watch nearby to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river. While her women servants walked along beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent one of her servants to bring it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. The boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. She said, "This must be one of the Hebrews' children." Then the baby's sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Would you like me to go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed. "Yes, do that." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child and nurse it for me, and I'll pay you for your work." So the woman took the child and nursed it. After the child had grown up, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I pulled him out of the water." This is the reading of the book of Exodus for this Sunday. You may know this story. You might be familiar with it. I dare say, if you went to Sunday school as a child, you remember the basket and the reeds from the felt board, right? The felt board? You know. Or maybe you saw a little cartoon about it. Moses is put in the basket and sent down the Nile. And really, that's what you get in the felt board, is the exciting part about Moses being put in the basket and being put in the Nile. But what you need to pay attention to, and what a lot of times we don't pay attention to, is that Pharaoh doesn't have a name. But there are people that are named in this story. Moses is named at the end because that's Pharaoh's daughter, whatever her name is. She names Moses because she pulled him out of water. Parents of Moses are not named. The sister, we know her name now because she becomes a part of the Exodus, Miriam, but she's not named. Who are named? Shiprah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives. The Hebrew midwives, named Shiprah and Puah. The author of Exodus writes their names down. That's why the Hebrews, to this day, call Exodus the book of names. And so the piece of art that you might have seen as you walked in is also, we're going to put the piece of art on the screen, which is, oh wait, no, this is not the one you would have seen because we're going to color this on Thursday. But it's called The Midwives' Decision. Puah and Shiprah. I really think that we need to remember those names. They're important. And Hannah Garrity, the artist that depicted them here in this painting called The Midwives' Decision, says this: fear God or fear people? The Hebrew midwives chose the right path. Here I have depicted the moment of their decision. Do I risk my life by saving the lives of all the Hebrew baby boys, or do I shed the blood of my friends' children because the ruler told me to? The wise women look up both ways, up to the grandeur of God and down to the flow of blood. The option seems more simple to me from afar than I think they were in the moment. Of course, they should break the edict of the king. However, it takes incredible bravery to stand up to human power. It is incredible that they were fearless enough to defy and lie to the king. The moral is easier said than done. We must always do the right thing, even when it puts our lives in danger. And she ends this way, just one sentence: be brave. Shiprah and Puah, our matriarchs, displayed bravery in the face of threat. They are the Sojourner Truths and Harriet Tubmans of the Old Testament. They deserve their place in our story, and we ought to take courage from their example. The liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt doesn't happen without these two women, without their resistance and struggle and resilience, their creativity in the face of threat, and the way they were dedicated to the preservation of life. They get named. And what's Pharaoh's name again? Oh yeah, just king. King of Egypt. Wilda C. Gaffney, in her book, Womanist Midrash. Remember what Midrash, I told you about Midrash? It's a Hebrew word that means a hedge that's built around something. And so we take scripture and you imagine it in a new way based on what happens in scripture and sound theology. So she writes this. This is her story of Shiprah and Puah. They call all the birthing women to assemble, telling their overseers that they are passing on Pharaoh's instructions. One Egyptian lingers longer than the others, and Puah shoos him out with the ancient womanist refrain, "This is woman's business." And he leaves. And hundreds of women come to the place of Shiprah's tent. And many bring daughters and granddaughters and nieces whom they are apprenticing in the profession of midwifery. Some are pregnant. Others are nursing. And it takes more than a day for everyone to gather and eat and rest from their journey. And there's talk. Shop talk, women's words, shared experiences, and new techniques. Herbs to stop bleeding and herbs to bring on labor and teas to increase milk productions and ways to limit pregnancies. Finally, Shiprah speaks. She tells them Pharaoh's words and the women gasp. Some mutter, some shout. Some of the children are frightened. Shiprah and Puah shush them and call for calm. Shiprah begins to prophesy. She says, God has brought our people a mighty long way. And I don't believe God has brought us this far to leave us. Do not fear this Pharaoh or his warriors, not his war horses nor his chariots. God will blow them away like smoke in the wind. In our days before our eyes, God will break the back of Egypt and wash away its might. God will raise up one of our sons to lead us and all our children out of this house of slavery. Our hands and our wombs do God's work. We will deliver the deliverer. We will keep him safe until that day that God calls him to lead us to freedom. And we shall receive our freedom dancing to woman's song. And if we trust in the mighty power of Shaddai, who drew us from her holy womb, whose spirit covers the earth. So Shiprah's prophecy in this midrash is that they will deliver the deliverer. And indeed, they do. She goes on to say in her commentary about this passage that the liberation of the Israelite people in Egypt begins with two women, Shiprah and Puah, that are named. And they are the mothers of a revolution waged by women. They likely enlisted untold numbers of birthing women and expectant mothers in their resistance movement. Their act of resistance sets the stage for those who follow. Shiprah and Puah become the first deliverers in the book of deliverance. So they're important and they need to be retained and held in this book of names and held up as our matriarchs. And then condensing the life of Moses in the first 3 chapters of Exodus, from his birth to his call by God to liberate the Israelites, we jump to chapter 3. Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law Jethro, a Midian priest. He led his flock out of the edge of the desert and came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it did not burn up. Then Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses said, "I'm here." Then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take your sandals off because you're standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and broad land, a land that's full of milk and honey. So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. And this will show you that I'm the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, if I now come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they're going to ask me, what's this God's name? What am I supposed to say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Translated, Yahweh. So say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Moses' call story with the burning bush. Dare say the felt board had a bush with the little flames on it. Moses, barefoot, and standing before it, but basically stopped in his tracks. So the painting that I have for this is the one you saw in the this is the one you saw in the narthex. This is a beautiful painting called Holy Ground by Lauren Wright Pittman. And you see, this is really impressionist, but I think it's really beautiful. And she writes this about this piece. In this piece, I imagine the leaves and flames of the burning bush image God's words for Moses. I have depicted God's message through symbols and imagery that start in the center and radiate out. The words in bold point to particular details I have rendered. I invite you to look for the ways God's words might be translated visually. God's eyes have seen the misery of God's people. The Israelites have cried out in the midst of their oppression, and God knows their suffering. God's hope is for Moses to bring the Israelites to a land flowing with milk and honey, and Moses will know it is God who called him. When they are out of Egypt, they shall worship God on this mountain. Leaves and flames and eyes and flowing milk and honey. What this passage says most about Moses, he sees the bush and immediately heads toward it to investigate. I might have gone the other way. He so eagerly approaches this miracle that God has to stop him and slow him down. Says, go no further. Take off your shoes. Don't come any closer. And sure, once the voice identifies itself as God, Moses covers his face and seems a little hesitant at that point. But he gains his courage back, trust me. Because the gesture of covering his face doesn't stop Moses from challenging God's plan. Who am I? And then what do I say to them? These are the questions that Moses asks God. It's almost reminiscent of Jacob demanding the blessing before he would let the nighttime wrestler go. Remember, we hold on to him? Why me? Says Moses. And whom do I say sent me? You want me to go to Pharaoh? Well, what am I, and you want me to go to the Israelites? What am I supposed to tell them? These are ways Moses shows his frailty, his concern, his, lacking faith. He's not trusting in the promises. He sees something he can't explain in front of him. He hears a voice, but he still has questions. And here he is, the liberator of all the Israelites, included in the transfiguration in the Gospels. He's a monumental figure in the Hebrew tradition. Moses is the Jesus of the Jews. He is eager, but a little panicked. And who can blame him? Moses is Moses because of the resistance and resilience of Shiprah and Puah. And not only them, but also Moses' unnamed mother, who when the Pharaoh says, "Put your sons in the Nile," says, "Okay." And she does it. Of course, she puts him in a basket so he will be preserved, and sends his sister to go and watch him as he travels down the Nile. But that's resistance. When the oppressor says, "Do thusly," the oppressed say, "Okay, so shall it be as you have asked." And that woman put her baby boy in the Nile, just as Pharaoh said she should do. And he ends up being the liberator of all people. So Shiprah and Puah, the deliverers of the deliverer. May they be our matriarchs. Of course we remember Moses. Of course we remember his sacrifice. But we can also identify with the way that he was like, "Are you sure you want me to do this?" And God says, "Yeah, I'm sending you. You're the one I'm sending. You're the one who was rescued from the Nile. You're the one, Moses." You're the one. He's eager, but a little panicked. But he was saved for a reason. When you think about your life and you go through the things that you've accomplished and achieved, and then you think about the ways in which you might have faltered or failed or just felt like you weren't enough, think about Moses. Were you rescued at any time in your life? Were you salvaged? And for what purpose? For what purpose? Will you listen for the call? Will you be eager as Moses was doing, even though he had questions, even though he had doubts? That's okay, God still used him. So that's the lesson we can learn. But we dare never forget the courage of the matriarchs, Shiprah and Puah. Stitch their names on a pillow and put it somewhere because they're important. Amen.